If you won't get rid of those filthy trees, I'll do it myself.
At 2:13 in the morning, HOA President Diane Holloway crossed onto my property with a pruning saw and cut a killing ring into my 100-year-old black walnut. Then she did the other two. She thought she was getting rid of leaves. My trail camera caught every second. I didn't confront her. I called an arborist. By morning, this wasn't vandalism anymore. It was a six-figure liability. And one email Diane had already sent to her own HOA board was about to prove she did it on purpose. To understand why Diane hated those trees so much, you have to understand that they were there long before she was. Long before the HOA, too. My name is Earl Bennett. I'm 62 years old, and before I retired, I spent almost 40 years building custom cabinets, staircases, tables, doors, and just about anything else people were willing to pay me to make out of hardwood. Wood has always made sense to me. People are harder. The property I live on came through my father's side of the family. My grandfather bought the original parcel when this part of the county was mostly fields, pasture, and gravel roads. He planted 3 black walnut trees behind the house. Nobody in the family knows the exact year anymore, but there is an old photograph of him, standing beside the smallest one. The date written on the back is 1927. By the time I was a kid, those walnuts were already enormous. My father taught me woodworking under them. When I was 17, a storm tore one of the lower limbs off the biggest tree. Dad and I spent most of a Saturday cutting it into sections and saving whatever wood we could. Years later, he turned part of that walnut into the dining table that still sits in my kitchen. So when people eventually asked what those trees were worth, I learned there were 2 different answers. One was the number an expert could put on paper. The other one couldn't be calculated. For nearly 100 years, nobody had a problem with those trees. Then a developer bought the pasture east of my land. Within a few years, the pasture disappeared. In its place came a subdivision with a stone entrance, decorative fountains, matching mailboxes, a clubhouse, and an HOA. My land was never part of that development. The county records were clear. The subdivision simply grew up beside me. Then a new house went up about 80 feet from my property line. White brick, black shutters, a swimming pool, perfect hedges, a lawn that looked like somebody measured every blade of grass. That house belonged to Diane Holloway. By the end of her first year there, she was on the HOA board. By the end of the second, she was president. And by her second autumn, she had decided my trees were her problem. The first time Diane mentioned them, I was unloading hardware from my truck. She walked toward the fence, pointed past me, and asked when I was having those trees removed. I actually looked behind me because I thought she meant something else. Then I realized she was pointing at the walnuts. I asked why I would remove them. She said the leaves kept blowing into her yard. Walnuts landed near her pool. Her landscapers had to clean them up. She said it like she was explaining a violation I should already understand. I told her trees lose leaves. That is generally how trees work. She didn't laugh. 11 days later, I received the first HOA letter. Across the top it said, "Notice of landscape non-compliance." According to the letter, my trees were creating excessive organic debris that affected community appearance and neighboring property enjoyment. I called the number at the bottom. Diane answered. I told her there had been a mistake. My property wasn't part of her HOA. She paused for a second and said my trees affected HOA property. I told her that still didn't give the association authority over my land. Then she changed the argument. Now it wasn't about HOA authority. It was about responsibility. She told me the leaves were increasing her maintenance costs. She said walnut husks stained part of her patio. Then came the phrase she would use again and again. Your choices affect property values. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This time the trees were nuisance vegetation, then hazardous tree debris, then a community safety concern. The trees hadn't moved. The property line hadn't moved. Only Diane's language had changed. So I pulled out the survey from when I refinanced my house. I made a copy, highlighted the property line, and mailed it to the HOA. I included one sentence. My property is not governed by your association. Please stop sending violation notices. 3 days later, Diane appeared at my fence with an HOA folder tucked under her arm. She pointed toward the walnuts and told me I didn't get to make my maintenance problem everyone else's problem. I pointed to the survey marker near her feet. I told her everything on my side of that marker was my problem. She looked at the trees and said, "Then keep your mess on your side." I remembered that sentence later. At the time, I just walked away. For about 6 weeks, I heard nothing. No letters, no calls, no visits. Then one morning in late spring, I noticed the crown of the western walnut looked wrong. The leaves were pale, thin. Some of the smaller branches were beginning to wilt. At first, I thought disease. Maybe drought. Maybe insects. Then the second tree started showing the same symptoms. A few days later, so did the third. 3 mature trees don't usually begin failing at the same time for no reason. So I stopped looking at the leaves and started looking at the trunks. The first thing I noticed was the mulch. It had been pushed higher around the base of the western tree than I remembered. I brushed it away. That's when I found the cut. It looked like somebody had dragged a blade across the bark. Then I followed it. 1 foot, 2 feet, around the back. The cut kept going. Almost a complete ring. I carefully lifted a loose piece of bark. The damage was deep. Whoever had done it hadn't just scratched the surface. They had cut through the bark into the living tissue underneath. I walked to the second tree. Same thing. Then the third. Worse. Somebody had taken a saw and worked almost completely around every trunk. If you know trees, you know what that means. It is called girdling. A tree moves water and nutrients through living layers beneath its bark. Destroy enough of that ring and you can kill a tree without ever cutting it down. You leave it standing. Then you wait for it to starve. For a few seconds, I just stood there. Then I looked toward Diane's house. Her lawn was perfect. Her pool was clean. My first instinct was to walk over there and start pounding on her front door. I made it maybe 20 feet. Then I stopped. Anger doesn't preserve evidence. I went back. I photographed every cut, the bark, the ground, the depth of the damage. Everything I could think of. Then I remembered the trail camera. 2 years earlier, deer had been eating plants near the back of my property, so I mounted a camera on an oak tree close to the fence. It wasn't there for security. It was there because I wanted to know what kept eating my garden. The camera faced a path that ran directly behind the walnuts. I took it down and brought the memory card inside. There were hundreds of clips. Deer. Wind. A raccoon. More deer. Nothing. Then I reached 2:13 in the morning. A light appeared at the edge of the frame. A person stepped into view. Dark pants. Gloves. A headlamp. A pruning saw in one hand. I froze the image. It was Diane. I let the clip continue. She crossed the property line, walked directly to the first walnut, knelt down, and started cutting. No hesitation, no inspection. She didn't look confused. She knew exactly where she was going. The next clip showed her moving around the trunk. Then she went to the second tree, then the third. The camera didn't need to capture every inch of every cut. It captured enough. I watched the footage 3 times. Then I copied it to my computer. I copied it to an external drive. Then I uploaded another copy for safekeeping. The original memory card went into an envelope. I wrote the date on it. I still didn't call Diane. I didn't call the HOA. I didn't post the video online. I called a certified arborist. His name was Mark Ellis. He came out the next afternoon. I didn't tell him who I suspected. I just showed him the trees. Mark spent close to an hour inspecting them. He measured the cuts, checked the crown, photographed the damage, examined the bark. Finally, he stepped back. He said the damage was deliberate. Whoever did it had cut deeply enough to seriously disrupt the tree's vascular systems. Then he said something more important. Whoever did this understood that the cuts could kill them. I showed him the video. He watched Diane cross my property with the saw. Then he turned back toward the largest walnut. He started measuring again. Diameter, height, the length of the clear lower trunk, overall condition. Then he asked me if I had ever had the trees professionally valued. I told him no. He asked if I knew what I had. I said Black Walnut. He nodded. Then he said, "I'm not asking about the species." That was the moment this stopped feeling like a simple vandalism case. I had worked with Black Walnut for most of my career. I knew good walnut lumber was valuable. But there is a difference between knowing what finished boards cost in a shop and knowing how professionals evaluate a mature tree that has spent a century growing. Mark brought in another specialist. They documented the diameter, trunk quality defects, canopy, condition, removal difficulty, treatment options, replacement impact, and the potential quality of usable wood. The largest tree had a long, clean lower section. The specialist explained that portions of mature black walnut with the right characteristics can be particularly desirable for high-quality veneer and woodworking. But the final damage calculation wasn't just about selling logs. It included the loss of mature trees, treatment attempts, eventual removal where necessary, restoration, and other documented losses. When the preliminary figure came back, it wasn't $5,000. It wasn't $10,000. The documented loss was approaching $83,000. I remember sitting at the dining table my father built and staring at that number. Diane had looked at those trees and seen leaves. The experts saw something that had taken 4 generations to grow. Then Mark told me to speak with a property attorney who understood timber damage. I expected the lawyer to talk about trespassing, maybe vandalism, maybe reimbursement. Instead, after reviewing the footage, he asked whether I had a current survey. I told him I had one, but it wasn't recent. He told me to get another. A licensed survey crew came out the following week. Diane watched them from her patio. For once, she didn't walk over. The result killed every ownership excuse at once. All 3 trunks stood several feet inside my parcel. No shared ownership, no relevant easement, no HOA authority. Then my attorney found something else. One of Diane's old emails. Months before the girdling, she had written that my trees were dropping debris onto HOA property. My trees. Her own words. She had already acknowledged they belonged to me. There was more. The HOA meeting minutes showed Diane had previously asked the board whether they could force me to remove the walnuts. The answer had been no. My parcel was outside their authority. So before she ever crossed the line with that saw, Diane already knew three things. The trees were mine, the land was mine, and the HOA had no authority to remove them. That was bad. Then Diane made it worse. Board members began asking why she had gone onto my land. Instead of staying quiet and letting her lawyer handle it, Diane got angry. She sent an email to several board members. Later, my attorney showed it to me. The first part complained about my leaves, my walnuts, her pool, and her landscaping bills. Then came one sentence. Since Earl refused to take responsibility, I handled it myself. My attorney read it once, then again. He pointed to another line. Diane referred to me as an outside property owner who refused to respect community standards. Outside property owner. She had just put into writing that she knew I wasn't in the HOA. And she had written that she personally handled the tree problem after I refused. The trail camera showed the act. The survey showed where it happened. The old correspondence showed she knew who owned the trees. The board minutes showed she knew the HOA had no authority. And now her own email helped establish why she did it. Within 48 hours, Diane hired her own attorney. That was the first sign that the HOA itself was stepping away from her. The board had never voted to enter my land. There was no emergency order. No arborist had declared the trees dangerous. No contractor had been authorized. No county agency had ordered them removed. Diane had acted on her own, and that created another problem: insurance. Diane apparently assumed the HOA policy would simply pay whatever claim came in, but deliberate conduct outside authorized HOA business created a much more complicated coverage question. Then my attorney explained the part that changed the entire case. In our jurisdiction, intentional destruction of another person's timber could trigger enhanced statutory damages. The exact rules differ from place to place. But the rule that mattered in our case was simple. Accidental damage and deliberate destruction were not treated the same way. He laid the evidence across a conference table. The trail camera footage, the survey, the arborist report, the valuation, the prior notices, the board minutes, Diane's email. Then he put the documented damage figure in front of me. About $83,000. He wrote the number down. Then he multiplied it by 3. $249,000. I stared at it. 3 trees, 1 pruning saw, almost $250,000. And that was before Diane finished arguing about expert expenses and the other costs surrounding the case. Suddenly, the same woman who had been sending me compliance deadlines was asking her lawyer what she might personally have to pay. Her attorney challenged the value of the trees. The experts had measurements and records. He questioned whether the trees were healthy before the damage. The arborist had documented their prior condition as well as he could from growth evidence and available photographs. He raised the property line. The survey ended that argument. He suggested Diane believed she was acting for the association. The board minutes showed she had already been told my property was outside HOA authority. Every time they tried another door, the documents closed it. People in the neighborhood started hearing about the dispute, but most of them heard Diane's version first. According to her, some unreasonable man outside the subdivision was trying to get nearly $250,000 over 3 backyard trees. She left out the part about 2:13 in the morning. She left out the saw. She left out the camera. And she definitely left out the email. The week of the annual HOA meeting, I saw Diane in the clubhouse parking lot. It was the first time we had been close enough to speak since the footage came out. She looked at me and said, "You really think you're getting $250,000 over some trees?" I didn't stop walking. I told her, "I'm not the one who calculated it. That was all." She still believed the size of the number made my case ridiculous. A few hours later, she was going to understand why it made hers dangerous. I wasn't an HOA member, but my attorney had been invited to the annual meeting because residents wanted to know why legal expenses were appearing in association records. I went with him. The clubhouse was full. Diane sat at the front beside 2 board members and her attorney. At first, she looked irritated more than worried. Then the HOA attorney started explaining the situation. He said the dispute involved property outside the association. People began whispering. One resident raised his hand and said he thought the trees were on the boundary. The attorney said no. A licensed survey confirmed all 3 trunks were entirely on my property. Another person asked whether the board ordered the trees removed. Number. Someone asked whether a county official had declared them dangerous. No. Then the attorney said, video evidence showed an individual entering my property after 2 in the morning and cutting into all 3 trunks. The room changed. A man near the front asked, 2 in the morning? Another voice said, with a saw? Diane leaned toward the microphone. She said she was trying to solve a problem I had refused to address. Her attorney looked down at the table. A woman on the aisle asked what kind of emergency required going onto somebody else's land in the middle of the night. Diane started talking about leaves, walnut husks, pool cleaning, landscaping costs, community appearance. Then another resident asked, "Did you know Earl's property wasn't in the HOA?" Diane didn't answer immediately. A board member did it for her. He said the board had discussed that exact issue before the incident. Someone else asked, "So you knew the land wasn't ours?" Silence. "And you still went over there?" Diane tried to talk about community standards again. The man in the front interrupted. "At 2 in the morning?" Another person said, "With a saw?" Then the woman near the aisle asked the question that finished it. "You did all of this over leaves?" Diane started to respond. The board member beside her opened a printed email. He read her own sentence out loud. "Since Earl refused to take responsibility, I handled it myself." Nobody laughed. That would have been easier for her. Instead, the room went silent. Then someone asked whether the HOA's insurance would cover the claim. The attorney answered carefully. He said coverage was still being evaluated because the alleged conduct was intentional and had not been authorized by the board. That was the moment people stopped looking at me. They all looked at Diane. For years, she had used HOA President like it was a rank. She had the letterhead, the notices, the meetings, the clipboard, the language about property values and community standards. But none of that changed the survey line. None of it erased the camera footage. And none of it could take back her own email. The dispute didn't end that night. Real cases don't end that cleanly. There were negotiations, expert reports, arguments over treatment and removal, arguments over valuation, arguments over the statutory multiplier. But the central evidence never changed. Diane complained about my trees. She was told they were outside HOA authority. She crossed onto my property at night with a saw. The camera recorded her. Then she admitted in writing that she handled the problem herself because I refused. The documented loss was approximately $83,000. Because the conduct qualified for treble damages under the law being applied in our case, that number became approximately $249,000. By the time the remaining costs and settlement terms were worked through, the resolution was effectively $250,000. $250,000. Diane couldn't simply hand the entire problem to the HOA and walk away. Her personal liability was substantial. Not long after the case was resolved, she was no longer HOA president. Whether she resigned voluntarily or was pushed out, I never asked. I didn't need to. A few weeks later, I was driving into town when I passed her house. Her white SUV was parked at the end of the driveway. There was a sign in the windshield. For sale. I looked at it for maybe 2 seconds. Then I kept driving. A couple of weeks later, the SUV was gone. I never sent Diane a message, never took a picture, never asked what she got for it. For the first time since I'd known her, her driveway looked as empty as she had always wanted my yard to look. But that wasn't the part of the story that mattered most to me. Money doesn't make 100 years grow back. The damage to the walnuts was severe. The arborists did what they could, but one tree declined quickly. Another eventually became unsafe as the canopy weakened. Some of the wood could be salvaged. When the time came, I saved as much usable walnut as I could and stacked it under cover. Months later, after it was ready to work with, I went back into my shop. I chose 3 sections, and I built 3 benches. Nothing fancy. Heavy black walnut. Simple lines. Good joints. Good joints. The kind of work my father would have inspected quietly before giving one small nod. One bench stayed behind my house, near where the largest tree had stood. One went to a local trades program that teaches young people woodworking and construction skills. The third stays with my family. Then one Saturday, my grandson came over. We dug 3 holes in the same ground my grandfather had worked almost a century earlier, and we planted 3 young black walnut trees. They looked tiny, almost ridiculous compared to what had once stood there. But that is the thing about planting a tree. You are doing something for a future you probably won't live long enough to see. The HOA elected new leadership. They tightened their rules about entering neighboring private property and required documented legal authority before any board member could approve work outside association boundaries. A few residents came over and apologized. Some didn't. That was fine. I never needed all of them to like me. I only needed them to understand where their authority ended. Diane thought this started because of leaves. It didn't. It started because she believed something became hers to control, simply because it inconvenienced her. She had the title, the HOA letterhead, the meetings, the threats about community standards. I had a property line, a trail camera, a survey, an arborist, and eventually her own words. The loudest person in the room wasn't the person with the most authority. She was just the person who hadn't realized the evidence was already building around her. Every spring now, those 3 young walnuts put out another set of leaves. And every time they do, I remember the reason Diane wanted the old ones gone. She wanted a cleaner yard. Instead, she paid nearly $250,000 for one lesson about private property. If you caught someone on your land at 2 in the morning, deliberately killing trees your grandfather planted, would you confront them immediately? Or would you do what I did, stay quiet, save the evidence, and start building the file? Tell me what you would have done.